Between December 1989 and February 1990, 10 people disappeared or died in the waters surrounding Kodiak Island, Alaska, in what would become known as the Kodiak Revenge. All adults, all connected to a single commercial crabbing operation. The methods were surgical: staged shipwrecks, disappearances during storms, equipment failures that weren't failures, falls from cliffs that weren't accidents. The perpetrators weren't rival fishing operations or Coast Guard agents. They were 4 members of the Larsen family, a father and his 3 sons, moving through the Bering Sea like phantoms, methodically erasing everyone who knew their secret. The FBI would later call it one of the most calculated elimination campaigns in Alaskan maritime history. But the motive wasn't territory, wasn't drugs, wasn't even revenge for violence. It was maps. Crabbing maps that had been in the Larsen family for 60 years, stolen by men they'd once called partners. Maps that showed secret crabbing grounds where king crab gathered to breed, migration routes that no other fisherman knew, coordinates that meant the difference between prosperity and bankruptcy in waters that killed without mercy. Port Lions on Kodiak Island wasn't much more than a collection of weathered buildings clinging to the shoreline in the winter of 1989. Population 412, scattered across a landscape where the Pacific Ocean met volcanic mountains in a collision of water and stone. The nearest real town, Kodiak itself, sat 47 miles north on roads that turned to ice when winter came, which was most of the year. Most folks in Port Lions had never been farther than Anchorage, 250 miles northeast. December in Alaska meant temperatures dropping to -20 Fahrenheit at night, rising to maybe 15 by afternoon if you were lucky. The air smelled like diesel fuel from boat engines, salt spray frozen on dock pilings, and that particular metallic scent of approaching storms that people who live by the sea learned to recognize. Mornings brought fog so thick you couldn't see the end of your own vessel. The sound of the place was wind howling through rigging, distant foghorns, and every so often the rumble of a fishing boat's engine starting up in darkness. But 1989 was a catastrophic year in Alaskan waters. The king crab industry that had sustained these islands for generations was collapsing. New federal quotas had slashed allowable catch by 70%. Japanese companies were buying up permits, driving prices down. In Port Lions, unemployment among fishermen hit 40% that winter. For men who'd grown up believing that knowledge of the sea guaranteed survival, watching the economy implode felt like a betrayal of everything their fathers had taught them. In places like Port Lions, crabbing wasn't just a business, it was identity. Always had been. Working the Bering Sea meant risking your life every time you left port, facing waves 40 feet high, winds at 80 miles per hour, water so cold it would kill you in 4 minutes if you fell in. The money was good when the fishing was good, but the real currency was knowledge. Knowing where to drop your pots, when to work which grounds, reading the weather and the water like your grandfather had taught you. That knowledge, accumulated over generations, was the only inheritance most fishing families had to pass down. And in 1989, with quotas strangling the industry, that knowledge was the difference between feeding your family and losing your boat to the bank. Secret crabbing grounds weren't just profitable. They were survival itself. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. This story depicts murder, death at sea, and morally complex situations that some may find disturbing. It is intended for mature audiences only and explores the darkest aspects of desperation and revenge. The events described are historical in nature and should not be imitated or glorified. What follows is a true account of how ordinary men become capable of extraordinary darkness when everything they've built is stolen, when the law offers no protection, and when the old codes of maritime justice seem more real than any statute written in distant capitals. The Bering Sea doesn't forgive mistakes. Eric Larsen had learned that lesson at 14 when his uncle's boat went down in a storm, taking 6 men with it. The sea had taken his grandfather at 62, hypothermia after a fall overboard. It had taken his cousin at 23, crushed between a crab pot and the gunwale when a wave hit wrong. The ocean was always there, waiting, patient as death itself. Eric was 54 years old that December, though the sea had aged him beyond his years. He stood 6'3", with shoulders built massive from hauling pots that weighed 800 pounds when full of crab. His face was weathered like driftwood, deep creases carved around his eyes from decades of squinting into wind and spray. 2 fingers were missing from his left hand, lost to frostbite during a storm in 1972, when the temperature hit -40, and the deck icing got so bad they'd nearly capsized. A scar ran through his left eyebrow, a souvenir from a snapped cable that had missed his eye by an inch. His hands, what remained of them, were massive. Knuckles swollen from breaks that had never set quite right, calluses thick as boot leather, scars everywhere from hooks and cables and the 1,000 small injuries that came with working the Bering Sea. When he shook your hand, you felt not just strength but damage. History written in scar tissue. Every morning, Eric woke at 3 a.m. in the house his grandfather had built in 1952, made coffee in a percolator that had survived 3 decades, and sat at the kitchen table studying weather reports on a crackling radio while he smoked hand-rolled cigarettes. He didn't talk much in those early hours, just sat, smoked, drank coffee strong enough to strip paint, and thought about the sea. By 4:30, he'd be at the dock, checking equipment on the Nordic Wind, the 52-foot fishing vessel that had been his father's before him. In winter, that meant working in darkness so complete you couldn't see your own boots, the only light coming from the boat's running lights and the occasional flare of his cigarette. The smell down at the docks was diesel and fish guts, and that particular combination of salt and rot that defined working harbors everywhere. He'd married Ingrid Holt in 1958, right after he'd saved enough money to buy his first boat. She'd been 17, daughter of another fishing family, and she'd understood what it meant to be married to the sea. They'd had 3 boys, and all 3 had grown up the same way Eric had. On boats, learning to read weather, learning to respect the ocean, learning that knowledge was the only thing that kept you alive out there. Olaf was 30 now, captain of his own vessel, the North Wind, married with 2 children of his own. He had his father's build, his father's silence, and his father's understanding that the sea gave nothing away for free. Magnus was 28, first mate on Eric's boat, quieter even than his older brother, content to work and watch and learn. And Bjorn was 25, the youngest, the mechanic, the one who understood engines and hydraulics and all the systems that kept a fishing boat running in conditions that destroyed machinery as easily as they destroyed men. Ingrid was 52, her hands scarred from decades of working the processing line when the boats came in, her eyes the color of Alaskan ice, pale blue and hard. She'd raised 3 boys while her husband spent months at sea, had buried her own father after a storm took him when she was 23, and had learned long ago that grief was just another weather condition you endured in these latitudes. What Eric valued most wasn't money, though there'd been good years and bad. What he valued was legacy. The maps his grandfather Kurt Larsen had started in 1929, when Alaska was still a territory and the crabbing grounds were unmapped and endless. Those maps represented 60 years of accumulated knowledge, 3 generations of Larsens learning the sea, marking coordinates, recording depths and currents and temperatures, noting where the king crab gathered. And in September 1989, that legacy was stolen by a man Eric had trusted for 18 years. Greg Nicholson had been Eric's partner since 1971. They'd met at the Anchor Bar in Kodiak, both young men trying to make a living in waters that didn't forgive weakness. Greg was 50 that winter, shorter than Eric at 5'9", but built solid, with a barrel chest and arms thick from years of hauling pots. His beard had gone white, though his hair still held some of its original red. He had a loud voice, the kind of man who could tell stories that kept a bar laughing, who remembered everyone's name and asked about their families. For 18 years, Eric had trusted him. They'd worked together, not as crew but as partners. Greg had his own boat, the Lucky Strike, a 48-footer that he'd bought used in 1970 and rebuilt piece by piece. They'd divided territories, helped each other during emergencies, shared information when the fishing was good. In the brutal economy of Alaskan fishing, where competition could turn deadly, they'd maintained something rare, genuine partnership. Greg had a crew of 9 men who depended on him. His 2 sons, Dale and Kyle, 28 and 25, both capable fishermen who'd grown up on his boat. his nephew Scott, 23, trying to prove himself worthy of the family business, and 5 experienced hands, Jack Bryant at 35, Tom Wilson and Rick Harris both in their early 30s, Vince McLean at 33, and Pete Dawson, the mechanic who was 42 and had kept the Lucky Strike running for 15 years. They were all good men, as far as Eric had known them. Hard workers, the kind of crew you needed in the Bering Sea where laziness or incompetence could kill everyone on board. They drank at the same bars, bought supplies from the same chandlers, attended the same memorial services when boats went down. In a town of 400, everyone knew everyone, and trust wasn't given lightly, but once given, was supposed to mean something. The maps had been in Eric's basement for as long as he could remember. His grandfather Toot had started them during the Depression, working off a whaling ship, learning the waters around Kodiak when the crabbing industry was still young. Newt had been methodical, almost obsessive, marking coordinates in a series of waterproof notebooks, drawing maps on treated canvas, recording depths with a handline, noting water temperatures and currents, marking where he'd seen king crab gathering, tracking their seasonal movements. When Eric's father inherited them in 1952, he'd continued the work, adding his own observations, refining Knut's data, expanding the maps to cover new territories as fishing technology improved. And when Eric inherited them in 1976, after his father's heart attack during a storm, he'd done the same. 60 years of accumulated knowledge, 3 generations of Larsens learning the sea, 1 coordinate at a time. The secret wasn't sophisticated. It was simply observation, patience, and time. The maps showed where king crab concentrated during different seasons, the migration routes they followed, the underwater ridges and valleys they preferred, the optimal depths and temperatures. They showed grounds that other fishermen never worked because they didn't know they existed. Rocky areas that looked too risky but held massive concentrations of crab if you knew exactly where to drop your pots. Deep water channels that crab used as highways between feeding and breeding grounds. With those maps, the Larsens could catch 3 times as much crab with half the effort. They didn't work longer hours than other crews. They worked smarter, dropping pots where they knew the crab would be, pulling them when they knew they'd be full. While other boats worked by instinct and luck, the Larsens worked by knowledge accumulated over 6 decades. The maps were kept in a waterproof safe in Eric's basement, wrapped in oilcloth, never taken to sea. The danger of losing them overboard was too great. Instead, Eric and his sons memorized coordinates, internalized the patterns, learned to read the water the way their grandfather had. The physical maps were just the reference, the master copy. The real knowledge lived in their heads, passed down father to son, the only inheritance the Larsen family had ever created that was worth anything. And Greg Nicholson had stolen it. September 20th started like any other day. Eric was at the dock at 4:30 a.m., checking equipment, reviewing weather forecasts, planning the day's work. The Nordic Wind was in good shape, freshly painted, engine recently overhauled by Bjorn, gear inspected, and ready. They'd head out at dawn, work the grounds north of Kodiak, pull the pots they'd dropped 3 days earlier. But something felt wrong. Eric couldn't name it at first, just an instinct developed over 40 years on the water. A sense that the rhythms of the harbor were off, that people were looking at him differently. When he stopped at the marine supply store for fuel, the owner, old Tom Hendricks, wouldn't meet his eyes. When he passed Greg's boat, the Lucky Strike, the crew stopped talking and watched him walk by. By noon, he knew. Magnus came down to the galley where Eric was eating lunch, his face troubled. "Dad," he said quietly, "you need to see this." They motored north to the grounds the Larsens had worked for 30 years, coordinates Eric's grandfather had first marked in 1934. As they approached, Eric saw what Magnus had seen, the Lucky Strike, working pots in water the Larsens had always considered theirs, not close to their territory, in it, exactly in it, down to the precise coordinates. Eric grabbed the radio. Quote 2. Static, then Greg's voice, too casual. "Hey, Eric. Yeah, we're trying some new spots. Fish haven't been great lately. Figured we'd explore a bit." "Those aren't new spots. That's our territory. You know that." A pause. "Eric, the sea's public property. No such thing as our territory. You know that." Eric felt something cold settle in his chest. "Meet me at the dock, tonight. We need to talk." That evening, Eric and his 3 sons drove to Greg's house, a weather-beaten structure on the north side of Port Lions. Greg met them on the porch, and Eric could see in his old partner's eyes that he knew exactly why they'd come. Quote 7. Eric said. They went inside. In Greg's workshop, spread across a table, were maps. Copies of maps, the Larsen maps, photographed and redrawn, every coordinate marked, every notation transcribed, 60 years of family knowledge stolen and reproduced. When? Eric asked, his voice flat. Greg lit a cigarette, his hand steady. Last year. You remember when you had the stroke? I came by to help Ingrid, check on you, went down to your basement, needed to use the head, saw the safe, wasn't even locked. I looked, Eric, just looked. Then I came back with a camera. And you didn't think to ask. 18 years, and you didn't think I'd share if you'd asked? Would you have? Greg's voice hardened. Quote 12. Quote 13. Quote 14, Greg said. Quote 15. Olaf stepped forward. Quote 16. Greg shook his head. Quote 17. Eric stared at his partner of 18 years. Quote 18. Quote 9. Quote 20. Eric said quietly. Quote 21. They left. On the drive home, none of the Larsen men spoke. Eric stared out at the dark water, smoking one cigarette after another, thinking about what Greg had said. The information's out there now, nothing you can do about it. But there was something he could do. The thought came to him fully formed, terrible and simple. If the people who knew the secret were gone, the secret died with them. The next day, Eric went to the Coast Guard station in Kodiak. The officer on duty was James Connor, a man Eric had known for 15 years, someone he'd helped once when Connor's boat broke down 50 miles offshore. Eric explained the situation, the maps, the theft, the coordinates being shared. Connor listened, sympathetic but helpless. Eric, I understand this hurts. But coordinates aren't protected by law, the ocean's public property. If Nicholson memorized where you fish, there's no statute against that. If he took photographs of maps in your house, that might be trespassing, but you'd need to prove he broke in. You're saying he came in with permission when you were sick? To help my wife, not to rob us. I get that. But legally, it's complicated. You'd need to prove intent, prove theft of intellectual property, which in itself is murky when we're talking about fishing coordinates. And Eric, Connor paused, uncomfortable. To make this case, you'd be admitting these maps exist. The IRS might wonder why a family of fishermen has such detailed records. Questions might be asked about how much you've really been catching all these years. Eric understood. The maps proved the Larsens had been more successful than they'd reported. Taxes avoided, regulations skirted. Going to court meant exposing everything, potentially losing not just the secret but their boats, their livelihood, facing fines they couldn't pay. Connor saw his face. I'm sorry. I really am. But there's no legal remedy here. Best advice I can give you is to find new grounds or try to outwork them. Or, he hesitated, maybe sit down with Nicholson again, see if you can work something out. Eric left the Coast Guard station understanding a truth he'd always known but never faced directly. The law couldn't protect what mattered most. The system was built for cities, for places where property had deeds and theft had receipts, not for knowledge accumulated over generations, not for legacy that lived in memory and maps, not for the only thing his family had ever created that was worth passing down. Over the next 2 months, October through November, Eric watched his family's business die. The Lucky Strike worked their grounds systematically, pulling massive catches. Greg had given coordinates to 5 other boats, captains he knew and trusted. Soon, there were 7 vessels working waters the Larsens had always considered theirs. The secret grounds weren't secret anymore. The Nordic wind's catch dropped by 75%. Money that had sustained them for decades evaporated. Olaf couldn't make payments on his house. Magnus had to sell equipment to pay bills. Bjorn took out a loan at 18% interest just to keep his truck. Ingrid started working double shifts at the processing plant, her hands bleeding from the cold and the knives. And every day, Eric watched the Lucky Strike come into port with holds full of king crab caught from coordinates his grandfather had discovered, his father had refined, and he had protected for 40 years. Watched Greg and his crew laughing at the dock, flush with money from catches they'd never have made without stolen knowledge. Watched his sons' faces grow harder, watched his wife age 5 years and 2 months, watched everything his family had built crumble. On November 1st, Eric and his 3 sons met in his basement, surrounded by the original maps Greg had photographed. The maps that had meant everything and now meant nothing, because their secrets had been stolen and shared. "We can't compete," Olaf said quietly. "Not with 7 boats working our grounds. The crab populations can't sustain it. They'll fish it out in a year and then no one will have anything." "We could move," Magnus suggested. "Find new grounds. Start over." "With what money?" Bjorn asked. "We're broke. We don't have capital to explore new territories. And even if we did, how long before someone steals those coordinates too? Greg proved it can be done." Eric hadn't spoken. He'd been sitting, smoking, staring at his grandfather's handwriting on maps made in 1929. Finally, he looked up at his sons. "Quote 34, he said. They waited. Quote 35. The basement was silent except for the wind outside. Quote 36, Olaf said carefully. Quote 37. Eric spread out a chart of Kodiak waters on the table, the same kind of chart his grandfather had used, marked with decades of notations. He placed photographs next to it, surveillance photos he'd been taking for 3 weeks. Pictures of Greg's crew, their movements, their schedules. Quote 38, Eric said. Quote 39. Magnus stared at his father. Quote 40. Quote 41. Eric looked at each of his sons. Quote 42. Quote 43. Bjorn said. Quote 44. Quote 45. Olaf lit a cigarette, his hand steady. Quote 46. Quote 47. Eric said. Quote 48. He pulled out a notebook, opened it to show pages of detailed observations. Quote 49. Magnus was shaking his head. Quote 50. Quote 51. Eric agreed. Quote 52. Quote 53. Bjorn asked. Quote 54. Eric's voice was flat, emotionless. I've made my peace with it. I'm 54. I've had my life. But you boys, you're young. You could still walk away from this. I won't hold it against you. The basement was silent for a long minute. Then Olaf stubbed out his cigarette. How would we do it? Eric pulled out another chart, this one marked with dates and locations. 3 months, December through February. Worst weather of the year when boats go down all the time. We space it out, make each one look different. Accidents have patterns, but if we vary the methods, use different approaches, it'll look like bad luck. A tragic winter, but nothing that raises flags. Who does what? Magnus asked quietly. Olaf, you handle the navigation. You know these waters as well as I do. If we need to guide someone onto rocks to stage a collision, you're the one. Magnus, you're good with equipment. Sabotage has to be untraceable, perfect. Bjorn, you're mechanical. You understand how engines fail, how systems break down, and I'll coordinate, watch, make sure we don't miss anything. This is murder, Magnus said again. Yes, Eric agreed. It is, and I understand if you can't do it. But I've spent 3 months watching thieves get rich off grandfather's life work. I've watched our family starve. I've made my choice. He looked at his sons. What's yours? It took 3 days for his sons to decide. 3 days of silence in the house, Ingrid sensing something terrible but not asking, her face growing more drawn as she watched her husband and sons. On the 4th day, November 5th, they met again in the basement. Olaf spoke first. I'm in. I've got 2 kids. I can't feed them if we lose everything. And Greg knew what he was doing. He knew he was destroying us. Magnus nodded slowly. I'm in. But we set rules. Only the 9 who know the full coordinates, no one else. Not the other captains who bought partial information. Not wives, not kids. Just the men who actively stole from us. Agreed, Eric said. The 5 captains who bought coordinates only have fragments. Without the core knowledge, what they have is useless. They're not targets. Bjorn was the last. I need to know we've thought about every angle. If even one of these looks wrong, if the Coast Guard suspects, they'll investigate everything. They'll find connections between us and every victim. We need perfect accidents. Eric spread out his planning documents. December 8th, Jack Bryant works the docks alone most mornings. Checks equipment on the Lucky Strike at 4 a.m. before the rest of the crew arrives. Storm coming that day, 40-foot seas predicted. He goes over the side in darkness, swept away. Body might never be found. Happens every year. December 19th. Tom Wilson and Rick Harris. They're working a small tender boat, the Marlin, running between Kodiak and Port Lions. There's an underwater ridge off Kodiak Island, barely charted. In fog with bad coordinates, they could hit it. Boat goes down, both drown before help arrives. December 28th. Pete Dawson, the mechanic. He's always working in the engine room alone. Fall down the ladder, break his neck. Railing fails maybe. Happens all the time on boats. January 12th. Vince McLean. He checks pots by himself sometimes, takes a small boat out early, disappears. Boat found drifting. Body never recovered. Another statistic. January 24th. Scott Nicholson. Greg's nephew. Fuel tank explosion on the Lucky Strike. Gas leak, spark, boom. One casualty. Tragic, but these boats are old. Maintenance issues cause accidents. January 31st. Dale Nicholson, Greg's older son. Hiking accident on shore, falls from a cliff. Happens to hikers every winter. Ice, bad footing, tragic fall. February 8th. This is the big one. The Lucky Strike itself. Greg and Kyle on board, heading out in storm conditions. Navigation system gives bad coordinates, leads them into a reef zone. Ship goes down. Both die of hypothermia if they survive the initial sinking. Coast Guard arrives too late. Storm makes rescue impossible. February 15th. Final target. One of Greg's associates, captain, who bought significant coordinate data. He dies in a bar. Appears to be a heart attack. Natural causes. Medical examiner won't look too closely at a 50-year-old fisherman dying of cardiac arrest after a lifetime of hard living. Olaf studied the timeline. 3 months, 10 deaths, that's a lot. Alaska loses 40 fishermen a year on average, Eric said. 10 over 3 months during the worst weather of the year? Tragic, but not statistically impossible, especially if each one has a different cause, different circumstances. The key is variation. We can't have a pattern. Each has to look unique. Weapons? Magnus asked. None. No guns, no knives, nothing that leaves evidence. We use the sea, weather, equipment failure, navigation errors, the environment itself. We don't directly kill anyone if we can help it. We create situations where the ocean does the killing. And if someone survives, Bjorn asked, if there's a witness? Then we abort, Eric said firmly. We don't hurt innocents. No wives, no children, no bystanders. Only the 9 men who know the coordinates and actively participated in stealing them. That's the line. We cross it, we become murderers for no reason. We stay within it, we're just men protecting their legacy. They sat in silence, the weight of what they were planning settling over them. When do we start? Olaf finally asked. Eric checked his calendar. December 8th, storms coming in that night. Perfect conditions. Then we have 4 weeks to prepare, Magnus said. We start now, Eric replied. The next 4 weeks were a study in methodical planning. Eric approached it like any other fishing operation. Identify the target, study the conditions, prepare the equipment, execute with precision. But instead of catching crab, they were planning deaths. Olaf spent his time studying navigation charts, marking reef locations, underwater hazards, dangerous passages that looked safe on the surface but hid rocks just beneath the waterline. He practiced with GPS equipment, learning how to input false coordinates, how to create navigation errors that would look like equipment malfunction. He studied the Lucky Strike's navigation system specifically, memorizing its model number, understanding its weaknesses. Magnus focused on equipment sabotage. He read technical manuals on marine hydraulics, fuel systems, electrical wiring. He learned where to cut a line so it would fail under pressure but not immediately, how to weaken a railing so it would collapse under weight, how to create a fuel leak that would take hours to become dangerous. He practiced on their own equipment first, then carefully repaired everything, making sure he understood exactly how each sabotage would work. Bjorn studied the men themselves. He documented their schedules, where they drank, where they walked, when they were alone. He took photographs with a telephoto lens from his truck, building a surveillance file on each target. He noted Jack Bryant's habit of arriving at the docks at 3:45 every morning, noted that Tom Wilson and Rick Harris always ran supplies on Thursdays. Noted that Pete Dawson worked in the engine room with headphones on, deaf to the world. Eric coordinated everything, cross-referencing weather forecasts, tide tables, and their targets' schedules. He identified windows of opportunity, backup plans if conditions changed, abort criteria if something went wrong. He bought weather tracking software, studied storm predictions, learned to read satellite data. He needed perfect storms, perfect fog, perfect conditions for accidents. They never discussed it openly. At dinner with Ingrid, they talked about normal things, boat repairs, equipment needs, fishing plans for spring. Ingrid knew something was wrong, but didn't ask. She'd been a fisherman's wife too long to push for answers that might break something. In the evenings, after Ingrid went to bed, the 4 Larsen men would gather in the basement and review their plans. They used code words when they talked, never names. Target 1 for Jack Bryant, Event 1 for his death. They spoke in euphemisms, remove, eliminate, handle, as if not saying the words made it less real. Event 1 is confirmed, Olaf would say. Weather window opens December 8th, 0400, conditions optimal. Equipment for Event 3 is prepared, Magnus would report. Fuel line modification ready for installation. Time to failure, approximately 6 hours after ignition. Target 7 maintains consistent schedule, Bjorn would note. Vulnerability window, 1800 to 1900 dock area, alone. They practiced scenarios, how to approach the lucky strike without being seen, how to board it in darkness, make modifications, leave without trace, how to alter navigation equipment in under 2 minutes, how to make a fuel leak look like corrosion, a railing failure look like metal fatigue, a fall look like ice. By December 1st, they were ready. The equipment was prepared. The surveillance was complete. The weather forecasts showed a major storm system arriving December 7th with high winds and heavy seas lasting 5 days. Perfect conditions. On December 6th, they met one final time. Eric laid out the rules again. No deviations, no improvisation. We stick to the plan. If something feels wrong, we abort. If there are witnesses, we abort. If conditions change, we abort. We don't take chances. We don't get clever. We execute exactly as planned, or we don't execute at all. What about after? Magnus asked. After it's done. How do we live with it? Eric lit a cigarette, his weathered face unreadable. Same way grandfather lived with it after he killed a man in a bar fight in 1947. Same way Dad lived with it after he cut a cheating partner's boat loose in a storm in 1963. Let him drift away. This family has survived for 90 years in one of the harshest places on earth. We do what's necessary and then we live with it. And if we're caught, then we confess. We take responsibility. We don't let mom or the wives or the kids take any blame. This is us. We own it. The storm arrived on schedule. December 8th, 1989. The storm hit Kodiak Island at midnight. Winds gusting to 70 miles per hour, temperature dropping to 5 degrees Fahrenheit, waves building to 40 feet offshore. The kind of storm that kept boats in harbor, that made even walking the docks dangerous, that killed people who made mistakes. At 3:30 a.m., Eric and Olaf parked their truck 2 blocks from the harbor, watching the Lucky Strike's berth through binoculars. The dock lights created small pools of illumination in the darkness, surrounded by vast expanses of black. Wind howled through rigging, making the boats creak and groan. Spray from waves breaking against the dock froze instantly on contact, creating sheets of ice. At 3:45, right on schedule, Jack Bryant's truck pulled into the parking area. He sat for a moment, smoking a cigarette, steeling himself for the work ahead. Then he got out, a big man in an orange survival suit, and walked toward the Lucky Strike. Eric and Olaf waited 5 minutes, then followed, keeping to shadows. Bryant was on the boat now, checking equipment, preparing for the day's work. He was alone, wouldn't be joined by the rest of the crew until 6 a.m. 2 hours of vulnerability. They boarded the Lucky Strike quietly, knowing every creak and groan of the boat from years of working alongside it. Bryant was below deck, in the engine room, his back to the ladder. The sound of the storm covered any noise they made. What happened next was simple and terrible. A shout, making Bryant turn, a step back, the railing that Magnus had weakened 2 days earlier giving way, Bryant falling into the ice-covered space between the boat and the dock, the impact knocking him unconscious, the freezing water doing the rest. By 4:15, Bryant was dead from hypothermia. By 4:20, Eric and Olaf were back in their truck driving home. At 6 a.m., when the crew arrived, they found the broken railing and called the Coast Guard. Bryant's body was recovered 3 hours later, 200 yards from the dock, carried by current. The Coast Guard report called it an accidental drowning. Man working alone in storm conditions, railing failed due to metal fatigue, victim fell overboard and died before rescue could arrive. Tragic, but not uncommon. Happened every winter. December 19th. Tom Wilson and Rick Harris were running supplies from Kodiak to Port Lions in the Marlin, a 28-foot tender boat. The fog that morning was so thick you couldn't see the bow from the stern. Navigation was done entirely by instruments, trusting technology to show you where the rocks were. Except the GPS coordinates Olaf had inputted into the Marlin system the previous night weren't quite right, off by 0.03 degrees. A tiny error, the kind that could be equipment malfunction, but enough to send them 200 yards west of where they thought they were, right toward the underwater ridge off Kodiak Island. The Marlin hit the rocks at 14 knots. The impact tore open her hull. She sank in 4 minutes. Tom and Rick had time to get into survival suits, but not time to launch the life raft. The water was 38 degrees. They lasted maybe 10 minutes before hypothermia took them. The Coast Guard found the wreckage 3 days later. The investigation noted navigation error, possibly equipment malfunction, possibly human error in fog conditions. No evidence of sabotage, just another accident in dangerous waters. December 28th. Pete Dawson was working alone in the Lucky Strike's engine room, as he did most evenings, performing maintenance. The ladder leading down to the engine room was steep, more like a ship's ladder than stairs. The railing was solid steel, bolted to the bulkhead. Except 2 of those bolts had been removed the previous night, replaced with bolts that looked identical but had been cut 3/4 through. They'd hold normal weight but fail under sudden stress. Dawson was carrying a heavy toolbox when the railing gave way. He fell 12 feet, landed on the steel deck, broke his neck instantly, dead before his body stopped moving. The crew found him 2 hours later. The Coast Guard investigated, found the broken bolts, concluded metal fatigue. Quote Note 8. Recommendations were issued, no suspicion of foul play, 3 men dead in 3 weeks. The investigation noted it was a particularly bad season, but not unprecedented. January 1990 brought even worse weather. Temperatures dropped to -15 Fahrenheit. Ice formed on everything, making the boats top-heavy and dangerous. The few vessels that went out came back coated in ice, their crews exhausted from constantly chipping it away to prevent capsizing. On January 12th, Vince McLean took a small boat out alone to check some pots he'd dropped the previous week. It was a common practice, checking pots between major trips, making sure they hadn't been disturbed by currents or other boats. He left the dock at 5:30 a.m., told his girlfriend he'd be back by 9. The boat was found at 11 a.m., drifting 3 miles offshore, engine still running. McLean was gone. No blood, no signs of struggle, no indication of what had happened. Just an empty boat with the throttle in neutral and 1 less man in the world. The Coast Guard searched for 3 days. They never found a body. The conclusion was obvious. McLean had gone overboard somehow, probably checking pots, maybe slipped on ice, maybe a wave caught him wrong. The water was 35 degrees. Even in a survival suit, you had 20 minutes before hypothermia set in. If he'd hit his head, if he'd been knocked unconscious, he'd have been dead in minutes. What the Coast Guard didn't know was that Magnus had disabled the boat's safety cutoff switch 2 days earlier. The switch that would kill the engine if the operator let go of the controls. McLean had been leaning over the gunwale, checking a pot, when Olaf's boat had come alongside in the fog. A push, a splash. The boat motoring away, leaving McLean thrashing in water so cold it felt like knives. They'd watched from 200 yards away through binoculars as McLean tried to swim after his boat, watched him weaken, watched him stop moving, watched the sea take him. Then they'd motored over, put his boat in neutral, and left it drifting. 4 deaths. Still no pattern the Coast Guard could identify. January 24th brought a different kind of death. The Lucky Strike was docked for maintenance, and Scott Nicholson was in the engine room working on the fuel system. Greg's nephew, 23 years old, engaged to be married, planning a wedding for the summer. The fuel tank explosion happened at 2:15 p.m. A spark from a dropped tool, a leak in the fuel line that had been carefully engineered to develop over the previous 6 hours, and suddenly the engine room was an inferno. Scott was killed instantly, his body burned beyond recognition. The fire department responded, put out the blaze, investigated the cause. Quote 1 Odora 9. Recommendations about ventilation and safety protocols. Tragic, but the Lucky Strike was an old boat. Things broke down. What they didn't find was the tiny hole Magnus had drilled in the fuel line, positioned so that fuel would drip onto the hot engine block, creating fumes that would eventually reach explosive concentration. What they didn't find was evidence of murder, because Magnus was too good at making sabotage look like neglect. 5 deaths. Greg Nicholson was starting to notice a pattern even if the Coast Guard wasn't. His crew was dying at an impossible rate, but when he went to the authorities, what could he say? That he suspected murder but had no evidence? That he'd stolen fishing coordinates, and now the people he'd stolen from might be killing his crew? That would mean admitting the theft, admitting he'd destroyed a family's legacy for profit. So he said nothing. And on January 31st, he lost his oldest son. Dale Nicholson was hiking on the cliffs north of Port Lions, a trail he'd walked 100 times. It was a clear day for once, cold but windless. The kind of day when walking helped clear your head, helped you think about things like whether your father's recent success was worth the price your friends were paying. He was found at the bottom of a 200-foot cliff, neck broken, frozen solid. The investigation noted ice on the trail, signs of slipping. Accidental fall due to winter conditions. Victim lost footing, fell to death. They didn't look for footprints nearby. Didn't check if someone might have been following him. Didn't question whether a man who'd walked that trail his whole life might suddenly slip on ice he'd navigated 1,000 times before. 6 deaths. 3 more to go. February 8th, 1990. The storm that hit Kodiak that morning was the worst of the season. Wind at 90 miles per hour, waves reaching 50 feet, visibility near zero. The National Weather Service had issued warnings telling all boats to stay in port. No one with any sense would go out in those conditions, but Greg Nicholson had no choice. 6 of his crew were dead. His nephew was dead. His oldest son was dead. The Lucky Strike was falling apart physically and financially. He needed one good catch to stay afloat, needed to hit the coordinates the Larsen maps had given him, needed to pull enough crab to pay the mounting debts. So at 4 a.m., against all advice, the Lucky Strike motored out of Port Lions with Greg and his youngest son, Kyle, on board. Just the 2 of them. No crew. Too few hands to work the boat safely. But they had no choice. They were drowning in debt, and the storm would clear by afternoon according to the forecast. They never saw the reef. The navigation system was giving them coordinates that should have kept them in deep water, safe passage through the islands. What it was actually doing was guiding them straight into a maze of underwater rocks that the Larsen maps identified, but no official chart showed. Coordinates that Olaf had programmed in 2 days earlier, during a brief moment when the Lucky Strike was docked and unguarded. At 6:15 a.m., the Lucky Strike hit the rocks at full speed. The impact tore open her hull from bow to stern. She began taking on water immediately, listing 20 degrees to port, waves breaking over her deck. Greg tried to radio for help, but the storm was blocking transmissions. They were on their own. The Coast Guard received their distress call at 6:18, barely audible through static. They launched a rescue boat immediately, but in those conditions, it would take at least 40 minutes to reach the Lucky Strike's last known position. They arrived at 7:05. The Lucky Strike was already gone, only debris field remaining. They found Kyle first, floating face down in his survival suit, dead from hypothermia. They found Greg 20 minutes later, a quarter mile away, also dead. The official investigation took 3 weeks. The conclusion: navigation system malfunction led vessel into reef zone during storm conditions. Captain and crew unable to correct course due to weather. Vessel lost with all hands. Cause of death: Drowning, hypothermia. Contributing factors: severe weather, navigation equipment failure, insufficient crew for emergency response. No mention of sabotage, no suggestion of foul play. Just another fishing boat lost to the Bering Sea, which happened every year. 2 more names added to the memorial in the harbor. 2 more families destroyed by the ocean's indifference. 7 and 8. 2 more to go. February 15th. The Anchor Bar in Kodiak was crowded that night, fishermen from a dozen boats drinking away the memories of a brutal winter. Deaths had been high this season, catches had been low, money was tight. Everyone was tense, grieving, trying to make sense of a winter that had killed more men than usual. Among them was Carl Henderson, captain of the Silver Bay, one of the 5 boats that had bought partial coordinate data from Greg Nicholson. Henderson was 51, overweight, heavy drinker, high blood pressure, the kind of man who looked like he might have a heart attack any day. When he collapsed at the bar at 9:30 p.m., clutching his chest, gasping for air, everyone assumed that's what had happened. Heart attack, too much stress, too much drink, too many cigarettes. The paramedics worked on him for 20 minutes but couldn't save him, dead on the scene. The medical examiner did a routine autopsy, found severe arterial blockage, enlarged heart, liver damage, cause of death, massive coronary. No surprise for a man in Henderson's condition. Case closed. What they didn't find was the digitalis that Bjorn had slipped into Henderson's whiskey, the heart medication that in high doses causes cardiac arrest, that metabolizes quickly and leaves almost no trace. What they didn't question was whether a man who'd been fine all evening might suddenly die of natural causes. 9 deaths. 1 more to go. But the last target would have to wait, because on February 16th, the FBI arrived in Port Lions asking questions. The call came from someone they never identified. Anonymous tip to the FBI field office in Anchorage. Check the Larsen family. 9 deaths connected to them, not accidents. That was all, but it was enough. Special Agent Sarah Mitchell arrived in Port Lions on February 17th with a team of 4 investigators. She was 38, 15 years with the Bureau, experienced in complex cases. She looked at the deaths the Coast Guard had ruled accidental and immediately saw patterns. 9 people dead in 3 months, she told her team, all connected to one fishing operation, all ruled accidental. But look at the victims. They're all from the same crew, the Lucky Strike, all working for Greg Nicholson. What are the odds? The FBI pulled all the investigation reports, re-examined evidence, interviewed witnesses. They started asking questions the Coast Guard hadn't. Who had access to the boats before the accidents? Who had technical knowledge to sabotage equipment? Who had motive? The Larsen family name came up immediately. Fishermen talked quietly at first, then more openly. Stories about stolen maps, stolen coordinates, about the Larsens catch-dropping while Nicholson surged. Stories about bad blood, about Eric Larsen's face when he'd confronted Greg, about threats that might or might not have been made. Mitchell interviewed Eric on March 1st. He was calm, cooperative, showed no signs of guilt. You quote 115. But Mitchell was thorough. She pulled phone records, found calls between Eric and his sons at odd hours. She examined the Nordic wind, found tools that could be used for sabotage. She interviewed Olaf, Magnus, and Bjorn separately, looking for inconsistencies in their stories. What broke the case was physical evidence. A fiber found on the Lucky Strike's navigation system that matched rope from the Nordic wind. A fingerprint on Pete Dawson's broken railing that belonged to Magnus Larsen. Security camera footage from a marine supply store showing Bjorn buying materials consistent with sabotage. Nothing definitive, but enough for a warrant. March 15th, 6 a.m., FBI agents and Alaska State Troopers surrounded the Larsen home. Eric was in the kitchen, drinking coffee, when they knocked. He didn't resist. Neither did his sons. They'd known this was coming, had known it since the FBI arrived. Ingrid watched from the porch as they took her husband and sons away in handcuffs. She didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't beg. She just stood there, 52 years old, watching her family destroyed. Later, she'd tell reporters her only words to Eric were, quote, 116, not, quote, 117, not, quote, 1 on 18. Just a mother's last instruction to protect her sons. The evidence mounted quickly. Tools with traces of metal consistent with the broken bolts, navigation equipment with Eric's fingerprints, detailed notes in Eric's handwriting, surveillance logs, schedules, plans that could be interpreted as murder plots. The GPS device they found in Magnus's workshop that matched the one on the Marlin. The trial began December 1990, nearly a year after the first death. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: motive, means, opportunity. They showed how the Larsens had systematically eliminated everyone who knew the stolen coordinates, how they'd planned each death to look accidental, how they'd used their knowledge of the sea to commit perfect murders. The defense argued circumstantial evidence, reasonable doubt. Yes, Eric had motive. Yes, the family had tools and knowledge. But did that prove they'd committed 9 murders? Where were the witnesses? Where was the direct evidence? The jury deliberated for 11 days, the longest deliberation in Alaska state history for a murder trial. They were divided, torn between evidence and doubt, between what seemed obvious and what could be proven. Finally, on December 18, 1990, they reached verdicts. Guilty. All 4 Larsen men, guilty of first-degree murder, multiple counts. The sentencing came in January 1991. Eric Larsen, life in prison without possibility of parole. Olaf Larsen, 50 years. Magnus Larsen, 45 years. Bjorn Larsen, 40 years. They were led away in chains, and Ingrid Larsen returned to an empty house that had once held everything she loved. Eric Larsen died in Spring Creek Correctional Center on January 4, 2001, at age 66. Pneumonia, complicated by lung cancer from 40 years of smoking hand-rolled cigarettes. He'd served 11 years of his life sentence, spent mostly in solitary confinement for his own protection after other inmates learned he'd killed 9 men. In those 11 years, he never expressed remorse. When reporters asked, when parole boards questioned, when chaplains counseled, he gave the same answer. "I protected my family's legacy. That's what a father does. I'd do it again." But late at night, in a cell that measured 8 feet by 10 feet, guards sometimes heard him talking to himself. Conversations with his grandfather Knut, arguing about whether the maps had been worth it. Conversations with his dead father, explaining why the legacy had to die with him. Conversations with Greg Nicholson, asking questions that would never be answered. He never wrote the coordinates down, never tried to pass them to his sons, never attempted to preserve the knowledge he'd killed 9 people to protect. When he died, 60 years of accumulated knowledge died with him. The maps that had been seized as evidence were destroyed by court order. The Larsen family's legacy, the only inheritance they'd ever created, vanished as if it had never existed. Olaf Larsen was released in 2015 after serving 25 years, his 50-year sentence reduced for good behavior. He moved to Seattle, changed his name, found work in a warehouse loading trucks. He never went near the ocean again, never ate crab, never talked about Alaska or fishing or the father who'd convinced him that murder was protection. His wife had divorced him in 1995, taken their children, forbidden him contact. He died alone in 2024 of a heart attack, 64 years old, working a night shift, collapsing between pallets of merchandise. His obituary didn't mention Alaska, didn't mention fishing, didn't mention that he'd once been Olaf Larsen. He was buried under his assumed name in an unmarked grave. Magnus Larsen was released in 2018 after serving 28 years. He returned to Alaska, but not to Kodiak. He found work at a dock in Seward, unloading boats, never captaining, never working crab. He lives there still as of 2025, 63 years old, alone, speaking to no one about his past. The other dock workers know there's something wrong with him, something haunted in his eyes when boats come in with crab. Bjorn Larsen was released in 2013 after serving 23 years. He tried to rebuild his life, found work as a mechanic in Anchorage, tried to reconnect with family. But the guilt was too heavy. On March 7, 2016, he drove to the coast, walked out on the ice until he found open water, and kept walking. His body was never recovered. Ingrid Larsen visited her husband and sons every week until 2003, driving 5 hours each way to the prison, sitting in visitor rooms, maintaining connection to the family that had destroyed itself. She died of cancer on August 16, 2008, 74 years old, buried next to Eric in a cemetery overlooking the sea that had defined and destroyed their lives. The Larsen property was sold in 2006, bought by a family from Oregon who knew nothing of its history. The house was renovated, modernized, all traces of the Larsen family erased. The new owner's children play in the yard where Eric once sat with his sons, planning murder, protecting legacy, becoming the very thing he'd feared. The families of the victims scattered. Some stayed in Alaska, some left for warmer waters, safer professions. Rose Nicholson, Greg's widow, remarried in 1997, moved to Seattle, rarely spoke of the husband and 2 sons she'd lost. She died in 2019, taking her memories of that terrible winter to the grave. The king crab population around Kodiak collapsed in 1995, overfished by too many boats working grounds that were no longer secret. The fishery closed for 3 years, reopened with severe restrictions, never recovered its former productivity. The coordinates Eric had killed to protect became worthless anyway, the crabs gone, the knowledge meaningless. In the end, Eric Larsen protected his family's legacy by destroying it completely. He eliminated everyone who knew the secret, and in doing so, ensured the secret died with him. The maps are gone. The knowledge is gone. The family is scattered or dead. And the only thing that remains is a question. At what point does protecting what we love transform us into the very thing we fear most? That question has no answer, only blood in cold water and families destroyed on both sides of an equation that never balanced, that could never balance, that was doomed from the moment Eric Larsen decided legacy was worth more than 9 human lives. 46 years have passed since that winter in the Alaskan waters, and the lesson remains unlearned. Violence breeds only more violence. Broken systems create their own monsters, and sometimes the line between protecting what's yours and losing your humanity disappears entirely, leaving only emptiness where love used to be. The sea keeps its secrets, and the dead tell no tales.